What's up, guys? Alexander here, Date Psychology. So, female psychopaths. I made a couple of videos recently, one on psychopathy. So if you're not too familiar with it, check that video, kind of going over the basics. This is going to be a short one about female psychopaths. How are they different? How are they similar to male psychopaths? We're going to look at some female murderers as well. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on those. Check, true crime channels if you want. The whole sordid story, but some psychology behind female psychopathy. Let's go forward and see here. So what do we know from a first paper here called Female Psychopathy, a descriptive national study of socially dangerous female NGRI offenders. We're looking often at female psychopaths that are incarcerated, right? So they're in jail because they've committed a serious crime, usually a violent crime. And given that, we want to know what's the nature of the violent crime, how is it different from male offenders, okay? So often with female psychopaths, and we'll see this kind of across the board, much of their violence is confined in the family. We'll go into that. They tend to begin with more property crimes than men, or at least at a ratio that's kind of higher than men, right? Male psychopaths also commit a lot of property crimes, but that's something we see with female psychopaths. Women in general don't commit a lot of crime. So that's something that stands out already if you have kind of that criminal versatility. One of the criteria in the hair PCL, right? They're often comorbid with other personality disorders, about 30%, 40%, often bipolar disorder, and often comorbid with drug addiction as well. So you'll see kind of other problematic behaviors across the lifetime. Similar to male psychopaths, a difference is with male psychopaths, you often see more comorbidity with antisocial personality disorder. And sometimes a diagnosis of one excludes the other. I think that kind of depends. But it would be borderline personality disorder with female psychopaths more often. And that's one, of course, one of the personality disorders that women are overrepresented in, tends to be seen as kind of a female personality disorder. Similar to male psychopaths, low compliance with treatment as well, right? You can't treat psychopaths. It's kind of a general wisdom around that. So let's go on, continue and see what else we got. Another paper here. Female Psychopathy and Aggression, a study with incarcerated women and Rorschach aggression score. So this is the ink blot tests, right? For whatever that's worth, just a quick one. So the hair PCL had correlations with certain interpretations of the ink blots, right? So people see these ink blots, they're supposed to be ambiguous. If they see more aggressive content, if they see more past aggressive content and potentially aggressive content in that kind of ambiguous image, yeah, that correlates also with female psychopathy. So kind of the diagnosis here or the outcome of this is, female psychopaths, they tend to have aggression, as you would expect in male psychopaths, but also potential feelings of entitlement, right? They feel very entitled to things across the board. Let's go on. Another paper. Is female psychopathy linked with child abuse? An empirical investigation using a person-centered approach. So this is looking at female psychopaths, again, that were incarcerated, and they're looking at their past history, right? So we know that there's a relationship between sexual abuse and psychopathy, but it's much higher in men, right? The odds ratios for women are about twice as much. So, 116% likelihood of membership in a high psychopathy group if the female offender was exposed to childhood sexual abuse, and 57% in the group that was characterized by high interpersonal manipulation and egocentricity. So we see that again here, typical of female psychopaths, egocentricity, right? What was the other one that we looked at in the previous slide? Similar to that. Let's go on. This one is called Psychopathy in Women, Insights from Neuroscience and Ways Forward. So something interesting from this paper, psychopathy is something that's diagnosed in adults, at least as far as DSM diagnoses. They don't diagnose psychopathy, but the personality disorders are reserved for adults, but there are childhood antecedents to that. And one of those is conduct disorder, something like oppositional defiant disorder, right? Which I think they call conduct disorder now. So differences between men and women here. Boys are more likely to engage in kind of overt conduct disorder, girls covert. And we'll get into that later on, because we'll also see that for female murderers compared with male murderers, there's a big difference. And that also seems to relate to covert versus overt strategies, okay? Women lure people in or try to hide their murders or take advantage of situations. Men are more deliberate. They go out, they find strangers, they hunt. So they say women are gatherers as murderers, men are hunters as murderers. And we see this in the antecedents of conduct disorder in children as well, that boys are more likely to engage in overt aggression, physical fights, crime and that sort of thing. Girls, more manipulation and all of that. So it might be difficult to detect in women early as well. Reading from an excerpt in this next slide here from this paper, okay? Rather than engaging in aggressive behaviors, young girls with conduct disorder may engage in minor norm-breaking behaviors and assume adult roles, perhaps by stealing or finding ways to obtain money, clothes, or drugs. In adults, one study investigated 197 female and 197 male patients admitted between 1984 and 2013 to one of 4 Dutch forensic psychiatric hospitals. This demonstrated that women with psychopathy compared to men with psychopathy committed more fraud, offended more out of relational frustration, and showed less physical violence, but more manipulative and self-destructive behavior. So a sex difference in psychopathy here. More manipulation in women, more self-destructive behavior, and these crimes may be related more to relational problems with a spouse, but often with children. And we'll see that when we get to the female murderers, that a characteristic of female psychopaths who murder is they often target male family members that are children. Going on to the next slide. Psychopathy and intelligence in high-risk violent women. So we know from past research, it's been kind of mixed. Do psychopaths have lower intelligence? Sometimes we see they're not lower. Sometimes we see that they are lower. It's usually not the case that we see high IQ psychopaths or anyone in criminal populations, right? Kind of contrary to, Hannibal Lecter media stereotypes. But what they did find in this was that there was a positive relationship with verbal intelligence, specifically that facet of IQ tests, and the Hare PCL scores for psychopathy. This may be related kind of to how psychopathy is expressed in women. We know that women, for example, have slightly higher verbal intelligence on average than men. Men have higher spatial intelligence, numeric intelligence, that sort of a thing. So when we see female offenders, psychopaths, we see deceitful behavior, egocentric behavior, but, characteristic of psychopaths is the ability to be charming, glib, superficially charming, and the ability to con others. So that could be related to better verbal ability in female psychopaths. Let's go on now. This paper is called Psychopathy in Female Gender, Phenotypic Expression and Comorbidity, a study comparing a sample of women hospitalized in Italy's maximum security facility with women who were criminally sentenced and imprisoned. So looking at these offenders that were imprisoned in this maximum security facility, crimes committed by female psychopaths were often characterized more by lying and manipulation, okay? They were often, at least their history of crime, was less violent than male psychopaths. To end up in a maximum security prison in Europe, usually you have to do something violent. It's not really like the United States. To go to jail in Europe, it's a little bit harder. You pretty much have to be a violent offender. So they were probably there for something violent, but if you look at their antecedent history, right? Their criminal history up to that point, it's going to be characterized by less violence than male psychopaths, up to the point that they do finally commit a more violent act. Next slide and next paper. This is called Women and Men Who Committed Murder. And now we're getting into some female murderers. Male-female psychopathic homicides. So, female murderers that have high scores on the PCL, they're less likely to have a previous criminal record. So we see that criminal versatility and criminal history in men more typical. And so if you remember from the past video, the 4 facets of psychopathy, one of them is antisocial behavior, which is basically a bunch of measures of like, do you commit crimes? Women score lower in that, but women score higher in kind of affective and interpersonal psychopathy, which is how do they feel? Well, they're going to be more flat emotionally, right? They lack empathy and feeling. They can't experience those the same way. And their relationships to others more problematic in that sense. So that's a way that psychopathy manifests differently for men and women. Men are more likely to engage in overt crimes. Women, on the other hand, are more likely to show psychopathy in their relationships with other people and kind of empathy deficits toward other people. Now we see in this paper also, looking at these psychopaths, the victims of these female murderers were most likely to be family members and children. It's much, much more rare that female psychopaths kill strangers. Male psychopaths who kill, they hunt, they will find victims. Women very often not. They will find their victims in people who are already adjacent to them, much less likely to be strangers, except men are more likely to kill romantic partners than women. Women are more likely to kill family members and younger children than men, psychopaths. Next paper. also another Italian study. There's a lot of papers on psychopathy that come from Italy. I think they have a lot of researchers kind of interested in that. It's called Psychopathy in Italian Female Murderers. Interesting from this paper, these are all recent papers, by the way, from 2019 onwards. This says, male violent offenses are down. So we see, across Western culture, United States, Europe as well, violent crimes have gone down over the last decade or so, but female violent crimes have not declined proportionally. Now, to start with, most violent crimes are committed by men. So we see a decline in violent crimes, right? Because not all violent crimes are committed by psychopaths. Only a fraction of violent criminals are psychopaths. But because it's so uncommon for women to commit violent crimes, probably a higher proportion of female violent criminals are actually psychopaths. So that might be reflected in these statistics where male violent crime is down, right? The non-psychopathic offenders who might otherwise get into some violent trouble, whatever's happening that's reducing that. Okay, but it's not going to reduce it much for actual psychopaths, okay? And that might be why female violent crime has not declined at the same rate as male violent crime. It's still lower than men, but whatever. Probably because a lot of these women, a higher proportion to begin with were psychopaths. And that's kind of what we see in this paper, yeah. Disproportionately psychopathic women are the ones who are imprisoned for murder. Men can kill if they're not psychopaths. Women, much less rare or much less frequent. Next paper, this is examining the psychosocial characteristics of female serial murderers. So now we're looking at psychopaths who are serial killers. Okay. They looked at 12 female serial murderers, and you're always going to have small samples like this in something on serial killers because there's just not that many, and then having access to them at the same time. So what characterized all of these? Practically all of them had an early history of childhood trauma and abuse. They all had unstable romantic relationships across the lifetime, okay? So we might see, as far as abuse goes, which is very common in these cases, that could be, as a lot of people would say, the nurture side of it, that abuse, trauma leads to antisocial behavior. Could also be genetic, that individuals more likely to come from troublesome parents, well, they also have the genes of those parents, don't they? And so what does that mean? Antisocial parents, antisocial kids, and what's the truth of the two? Probably a mix, like everything in personality psychology, right? Person, environment, interaction. They have a history of antisocial deviance. So crime, but not always crime, rule breaking, norm breaking, and team disintegration, they mentioned, which is basically low levels of cooperation. These are people that just can't get along with others, starting kind of early in life. Let's go on to the next slide. I'm going to read this passage for you and point something out from it. So Keller and Keller, and this is an old model here from 1998, they noted that female serial offenders or murderers killed more for extended periods, 8 years on average, than their male counterparts. But they also started killing later in life at around age 25. Serial murders are more likely to kill individuals with who they have a close relationship, like family members, children, and romantic partners, it says in this case. Although it seems to be that as far as a romantic partner, it might actually be men. So what's interesting here, I've mentioned this in past videos, well observed in criminology, is something called the age crime curve, which is that most crimes are committed by young males between 16 and 25. Most crimes, and particularly most violent crimes. Following age 25, most violent criminals desist. Most criminals in general do, but even people with a violent history tend to desist unless they are high in psychopathic traits. If it's subclinical or diagnosed as antisocial personality disorder or high on the PCL, whatever. Most people desist, some don't. We see here something that's kind of a violation of the age crime curve, don't we, in female psychopaths. They wait until they're out of that range to start offending more, which goes to show, psychopathy is a persistent thing over the lifespan, which is true of personality disorders, personality that is not a disorder, just personality in general, right? That personality is very stable over the lifetime. So we see here behaviors over the lifetime. Why do they kill for a longer period of time? Probably because they're not going out to find victims, right? Probably because, maybe they're doing it less frequently, less of a spree, something like that. I'm not entirely sure, but could be something like that. They manage to evade detection longer, and that might even be because they are women, right? Because we don't tend to look for women as an initial suspect. And who gets arrested for a murder depends a lot on if there is kind of an initial suspect. There was a TV show, The First 24 or whatever, and it was like, yeah, if you don't have a suspect in the first 24 hours, it makes it much, much more difficult. Usually murder suspects are like a family member, the husband, the butler or whatever, and right away. When you don't, when it's a stranger or there's not a good indication of who it is, yeah, those are the murders that go unsolved for a long period of time. Next slide. This is called a review of psychopathy and cluster B personality traits and their neural correlates. So cluster B personality traits, right? Borderline personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder, antisocial, narcissism, okay? So disinhibition and emotional dysregulation are the behaviors characteristic here. And what do we know about the brain that's related to that? What do we see in studies of MRI, for example, looking at the brains of psychopaths versus non-psychopaths? We tend to see that they have frontal lobe deficits, some abnormalities or differences in the frontal lobe. That's related to disinhibition, okay? Frontal lobe is where you control impulses. This is a distributed thing over the brain. It's not neatly broken into sections, kind of like we tend to think of in older models. But yeah, some areas contribute a little bit more. The frontal lobe, big for control and inhibition, okay? We see also in the brains of female psychopaths, they have limbic and paralimbic deficits, okay? The limbic system, it's related to emotional responses. And we know that a feature of psychopathy, right? Flat affect, not feeling empathy, not being able to read the emotions of others very well, all of those sorts of things, being able to do evil things and not caring. So they have deficits in emotion and they have deficits in inhibition, which of course will make someone more willing to do bad things, more willing to do risky bad things. You can see how, in extreme cases that could lead to murder. Let's go on, next slide. Female primary and secondary psychopathic variants show distinct endocrine and psychophysiological profiles. So the endocrine system, hormones, right? They interact with the brain, neurotransmitters as well. So what do we see in these individuals? They have higher cortisol and testosterone ratios, which could be related to higher stress or a higher tolerance for stress and higher aggression. And these fit the profiles of individuals here, the hormonal profiles of individuals who were kind of high in anxiety and also kind of that had a past history of maltreatment, because that can also kind of contribute to lasting changes in someone's hormonal profile, right? People that have anxiety disorders, a little bit higher cortisol on average, that sort of thing. People, when they become stressed physically or emotionally, cortisol shoots up, yeah. So that's something that you see kind of persistent in these psychopaths, that they have differences in the brain. They also have differences in their hormonal profile. Let's go on to the next slide. We've gone over some of the basic research looking at differences, female psychopaths, who do they kill, that kind of a thing. We'll go through some famous female psychopaths, and I'm not going to go through their whole life history or their story. As I said, True Crime Channel would be best for that. But we can see some of the trends here, okay? Eileen Wuornos is one. She was a prostitute. She killed her Johns, or her clients, right? As I mentioned, males use a hunting strategy. Women use a gathering strategy. So these are people that would have come to her, right? That she essentially lured in a sense, as opposed to victims that she sought out. Why do we see that in female psychopaths versus men? Well, some of that, could be, behavioral differences in the brain. Some could be related to physical strength, 3 standard deviations difference in upper body strength between men and women. If women are going to kill someone, particularly if it's a man, like a John or something that's, coming to have sex with them, they're not going to be able to overpower them physically. They're going to have to be a little more stealthy about it, maybe use a weapon. And that's another thing that you see. Actually, in these female psychopaths, perhaps surprisingly, they're actually more likely to commit murders with a firearm, right? The equalizer as far as physical strength goes. Next slide, Christine Falling. So she had a history of mental illness, again, as we've seen in the research, comorbidity with mental illness and psychopathy, okay? A schizotypal personality disorder as well. Schizophrenia can be, but not as large of a relationship, but certainly the personality disorders. She killed children that she was supervising as a nanny. So we're seeing victims that are weaker and victims that she has access to, and again, children. Next slide. Dorothea Puente. So she had a very long criminal history that was nonviolent. She ran like a gambling house, did a bunch of fraud, check fraud, and eventually she started killing men to rob them with drugs. She would give them sedatives or anesthetics, that sort of a thing, and ended up killing a lot of men doing that. So, a financial motive here, and that's an instrumentality that you see with psychopaths, that they're willing to take advantage of people for their own gain, even if it's very disproportionate, right? Like murdering someone for money, Usually when you see murders that are not psychopaths, they have a motive that is often kind of emotional It's not as calculating. This is, more typical of psychopaths in some cases. It's very, very calculating. And when looking at psychopaths that are career criminals, and again, in Italian studies, they've done this. They looked at members of the mafia. They said, okay, most of these members of the mafia that have been arrested, they're in maximum security prisons. They're not psychopaths, but they do have a rate of psychopathy much, much higher. Richard Kuklinski, the Iceman, a famous mafia hitman, psychopath, right? And, so these are kind of things that, some psychopaths, if they want to kill and they want to make money, maybe they gravitate toward, killing people for money. Next slide, Velma Barfield. So she also had a history of fraud. So we see a history of crime that is not as typical for women as it is for men. So, you're seeing women engaging in more typical male behavior already. That should raise some red flags because it's so atypical for women. Troubled history with relationships and all of that. Okay, she poisoned her boyfriends. So again, we see, a close interpersonal relationship, people close to her, that kind of a thing. Next one. This was Janine, and I didn't put the last name on the slide, but you guys will know. Anyway, she was a serial killer as well, and she killed children as a nurse in a hospital. Okay, again, with some kind of anesthetics or sedatives or something like that. No one had any idea, she was doing this, except that they started to notice like a disproportionate number of children are dying when she's on duty. So then they began to look into it. So that's another thing, you have serial killers like this. There's no motive. So it's often difficult to even tell what's going on. This is the kind of history or killing, that went on for a long time. And someone just kind of noticed, like, weird that all these kids are dying, and how do we connect the dots here? But, these are things that maybe not, didn't even look like a murder at the beginning. So that is the last slide. Faster video for you today, but I wanted to cover some sex differences in psychopathy. Differences between men and women. A lot of the things are actually the same, except, it's more rare in women. But when it does manifest in women, you will see it manifest in different ways. So, hope you liked the video. Like, subscribe, hit the bell. I'll make another for you very soon.